Hello, and welcome to the C-Suite Chronicles podcast. We're bringing you the top voices in tech leadership. Female leadership is on the rise. According to a 2023 report from IBM, there are 12% more women in the C-suite and sitting on executive boards. And Deloitte Global predicted in 2022 that female leadership will continue to grow in the tech industry, especially at larger companies. Nonetheless, gender equity remains a challenge for most organizations, especially in leadership. With 45% of women eligible for retirement and 30% of women planning to leave the workforce because they're feeling disconnected and undervalued, company leaders need to focus their attention on cultivating and retaining future generations of female leadership. I have the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Carol Parker Walsh on this episode of the C-Suite Chronicles to talk about the systemic challenges many organizations face today when it comes to developing and keeping female leaders. And she offered concrete advice for building a more inclusive, supportive culture that drives innovation and creativity. Dr. Carol is the founder and owner of Carol Parker Walsh Consulting, a boutique strategic advisory, coaching, and training and development firm specializing in helping organizations unlock innovation by elevating their senior and high potential leaders and professional women to make power moves that will allow them to advance or pivot in their career. She's an award-winning master certified executive coach, personal brand specialist, TEDx speaker, and 3-time Amazon best-selling author. A sought-after international keynote speaker, Dr. Carol is a fellow of the Harvard Institute of Coaching and a published member of the Forbes Coaches Council, Newsweek Expert Forum, Harvard Business Review Advisory Council, and Entrepreneurs Leadership Network. She's also the resident career expert on ABC's AM Northwest morning show. Get ready for a lively, inspiring discussion. I'm Robin Kurtek, and this is the C-Suite Chronicles. Dr. Carol, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm so excited to talk to you. Before we get started, I was wondering if you could just give our audience a brief introduction to who you are and a little bit about your background.
In terms of my background, I have spent almost 30 years in the employment space. And so I started as a labor and employment attorney, specializing in labor and employment contract negotiation, and as well as employment discrimination litigation. And I did that for about 10 years before I decided that I wanted to start helping organizations not be sued. So I started moving into, I had a stint as an HR director and used to help organizations really establish like their HR function, and then started doing organizational consulting where I was in organizations coaching and training leaders, CEOs, doing work group development, team development, just really helping them strategically be able to create better working environments and for better outcomes with their teams and their employees. And from there, I decided to continue on with my education. I got a doctorate specializing in human development and organizational systems, and started teaching leadership and understanding leadership and systems and organizational systems, and along the dissection of structural inequity within organizations and in society. So I moved into academia. From there, went into academic leadership, where I directed a public health program, directed a couple of graduate programs in leadership development, and stepped into becoming an associate dean. And from there, decided somewhere around the precipice of my 50th birthday to really go back to what I really loved, which was coaching and consulting. And really, I primarily work with female leaders, female executives, high achieving professional women to really elevate and advance them into the work that they're meant to do in the world. And I still do organizational consulting and working with groups and teams and really helping to foster more safety and inclusion within organizations and supporting them in that regard. And so that's the work that I do today.
That's awesome. It's quite a varied background, and the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives are very near and dear to our heart here at WTIA. So it's always a pleasure to have folks on the show to talk about this stuff. Which is a great segue into our discussion today. The tech industry is working towards becoming more inclusive. That's one of the North Stars of what we do at WTIA. And there has been, and there's a pervasive talent shortage. Everyone knows that. We've talked a lot about that. And particularly among female leadership in tech, Deloitte Global had a recent study that's getting better. They said, I think it was 1 in 4 women are projected to be, or were projected to be last year, leaders of larger tech companies. A lot of the folks that we work with and a lot of the folks who are listening to this show tend to be leaders of smaller companies. So I wanted to talk a little bit about today. You talk about talent pipelines and that it really is a challenge for organization, and particularly related to women now and sort of this complex hybrid environment. We've had a market change in the way that we work. A lot of folks are still working remotely, but now there's kind of this hybrid environment where you've got some days are remote, some days are in the office. And I think that's created some challenges for folks, and particularly around leadership. How do you handle employee engagement and mental health issues, and make sure that everybody feels connected all the time, whether they're working remotely or in the office? So would love to kick it off there and have you kind of walk through why that's such a difficult issue for organizations right now.
Yeah, there's a lot there to really unpack, and one of the biggest challenges that to this issue is that organizational culture and environment is still trying to, in many ways, fit a round peg into a square hole. So we're still operating, we're still trying, much like the pandemic where we were hoping to kind of go back to normal, we're still operating under the same tried and true kind of practices and policies and ways of thinking about the way we do our work, how we build community, how we have connection, how we foster engagement, using kind of old practices and principles, as opposed to thinking of something much more inclusive, much more innovative, and much more creative to really meet the needs of who is in the workforce today, right? There was a great article that came out a couple of months ago by Fortune that really talked about that we're still using very kind of old patriarchal, post depression era kind of thinking in how we structure the way we work and how we structure environments. And so while we have seen, I know the IBM just put out a recent report in 2023 talking about that we have seen about a 12% increase in women in leadership, and we've seen some great progress, but there's still so much more to go because we're still anticipating that over 30% of women are planning to leave the workplace because of this disconnect within the environment. And so it just requires us, one of the underlying principles that I think is really important in this kind of equation of developing, innovative workplaces that allow for this hybridity and the opportunity to, kind of co-create across the way we work, is having inclusive leadership, right? Having psychological safe and authentic spaces of trust, having a human first people approach to how we think about the way we work with individuals and engage with individuals. And so utilizing these kind of conceptual frameworks can really help us shift, the whole way that we're doing business as usual, if we will, in the workplace. So if we could change the environment and not just look at changing the people, but really looking at changing the environment in which they work and coming up with more creative and innovative ways to do that, it would really make a huge difference in the projection of really closing the pipeline and really elevating more women, particularly within upper echelons of leadership within organizations.
On that note, how do leaders recognize this is a problem for their organization? What tells them that their quote unquote check engine light is flashing red? I mean, are leaders cognizant of this, or are they becoming more aware?
Well, one thing that some are, and I think, and they're starting to take some action. And at least the companies that we've been working with are the ones who are saying, yes, we're seeing this as an issue, and we want to make a difference. We really want to change the conversation around how we promote and advance women leadership within our organization. But one of the huge blinking red lights is the fact that 45% of the workforce is eligible for retirement. So that's a massive amount of women not only ready to leave the workplace, but also eligible for retirement. So we're having this gap between senior leadership knowledge and the younger generation that's coming forth to be able to fill that gap. So if they start to leave and retire, and we haven't done a good job of filling that pipeline to make sure that the next generation has a place and has institutional knowledge and has some experience and exposure, then there's going to be continually be that kind of dearth in between the two. The other thing is that if you're experiencing the great breakup, I know that was a big term that was, bandied about last year, but it's, like I said, it's still going on. As I said, the latest studies predict up to 30% of women plan to leave the workforce, and 24% of them plan on leaving permanently, right? Not just temporarily, not because of family and other obligations, which some of that 30% a lot for, who are thinking about changing or moving or doing something different. But we're talking about a strong population of women that are thinking about not coming back. And then also, if you are seeing your leaders who are leaving the workforce and you're not filling them in, you probably are challenged with retention and attracting methodology, that you're trying to bring in more people in the workforce, right? Because if you don't have uh, a, enough female leaders who people can feel like they can be mentored by, they can look up to, they can see that there's possibility for them to be able to promote, then you're probably struggling with recruiting and retaining females leadership, or just females generally within your workforce, if they don't see that there's a trajectory for them in the organization. So those are a few of the red lights that you may either be aware of in your organization right now, but definitely some of the check engine lights that you want to think about collectively that are happening societally, that if have not impacted your organization right now, will definitely be impacting your organization over the next 12 months.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, 30% of women planning to leave the workforce and not coming back, that's
That's
monumental.
staggering. Yeah, that's a staggering figure. And a lot of it, as I said, has to do with our initial conversation about not creating an environment that's really supportive, that's innovative, that's forward thinking, to think about ways to really meet the needs of the diversity of women within the workplace, right? Part of the reason why I talk about inclusive leadership is that, yes, while inclusive leadership talks about fair and respectful treatment, the way I think about it is that if we have capability and capacity to have diverse thinking, we do that when we have diverse thinkers, right? So when we start bringing in more women, we start bringing in people that can contribute to that innovation, which impacts organizations tremendously, then we can start really chipping away at some of the underlying issues that will create a space for women to feel like they can thrive and not feel like they have to exit or leave organizations.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things that struck me too, as you were talking, is this idea that, you have people leaving organizations, you have, a large number of people retiring or eligible for retirement. And if you're not backfilling, like you said, if they don't have that mentorship, the younger generations, if they don't have that membership, all of that legacy IP gets lost too.
It gets completely lost. Yes. Yes. And so the other thing, and McKinsey talked about this, the broken rung, right? So not only is the legacy lost, but there's nobody kind of pulling them up and supporting them. The new generation, that Gen Z that's coming in massive amounts, that are going to take over the workplace by 2030, are not getting the support they need to really be positioned to step into those leadership roles. So you're right, you're losing IP, you're losing institutional knowledge, you're losing experience, and different levels of support in ways that women can support other women, in ways that just no one else can.
Yes, absolutely. What are some ways that organizations can address this problem?
Yeah, that's a really great question. One of the first thing that I think organizations think about doing is, mentoring and sponsorship. Like, we hear that all the time. Let's mentor, let's sponsor. Here's the problem. If you look at the data, most mentoring and sponsorship programs are ad hoc. They're not formalized. There's no training for the sponsor. They're just volunteers who say, hey, let me, I'd be more than happy to help to take people under my wing and support them. But there's no reward mechanism. There's no internal process to show that when you go through this, here's what the outcome could potentially be for the individual. So the mentorship and sponsorship programs that are usually within organizations just aren't as effective as they could be. Every now and again, someone squeaks through and has an amazing experience. But studies have shown that women who have gone through them, that the experiences are all over the place. So there's nothing really consistent showing that it works. If they work well, great. But if they don't, that's problematic, right? The other thing is doing, training and awareness events and the things of those natures, these broad-based experiences for individuals, thinking that if they just get trained, if they get enough information, enough support, then they'll be promoted. But those don't really work either, because the thing that they're not doing is thinking about, how do you engage in behavioral changes and how do you incorporate it into a daily practice? And they're also not thinking about, how are you providing the level of support that's going to be ongoing and lasting for the individuals? One of
Mhm.
the things that we do, and I think is really successful and data supports this, is doing things like reverse mentoring, where you have women who are changing the conversation and maybe mentoring men in the organization, so they have some experiences around what that feels and what that looks like. There was I saw a fascinating, I was keynoting in a conference and someone else was talking about some work that they were doing in manufacturing and how they utilize this idea of reverse mentoring, where the women were able to, kind of do some mentoring for the men so they can have an understanding and experience of what their experience is like within the organization, that really had a high level of success in shifting behavioral change and having that diverse thinking and that diverse way of behavioral changes that actually made an impact in seeing more women rise into positions of leadership and higher levels of retention. So we just, again, it has to be more innovation, right? So we have to think about doing things. One of the things that we do is to create peer-to-peer mentorship and mastermind opportunities for women to come together and have support with each other, to have that reverse mentoring, to really train sponsors so that they understand what the role means, so that they can actually be of really use, that they really want to be when they're doing and engaging in taking on the role of sponsor, but doing it effectively, and helping the organization create a program that really fosters and supports sponsorship, so as part of the organizational culture and not just an ad hoc event that happens within organizations. So, the training, the awareness events, the mentorship and sponsorship are great, but they're just not as effective unless we think about it at a level deep to really make an impact into organizations.
Right, right. Well, if an organization is committed to this and, maybe they've tried some of these methods, maybe they haven't, maybe they're really not sure where to start, where can they go to get help? And how do they know to differentiate, whether they need to go outside for that help or whether they can create these programs within their own organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually just recently published an article in Entrepreneur Magazine about how utilizing external trainers can really impact your bottom line. Listen, I know for the most part, they try to go internally with their L&D and DEI teams to get this happen, to make this happen, but they're often understaffed and overstretched with all the initiatives and priorities of upskilling and reskilling and all the other things that they have to take care of, hiring, recruiting, retaining the employees that are there. And so really seeking out external, support is probably one of the better ways to go, because you're bringing someone in who has some subjectivity, so objectivity rather, that's not in the system, but can actually come and really provide something that's going to be more useful. And I would say even be careful about, going with too big of a system, because they're going to probably bring some prepackaged ideas to the table and not really be in a position to really customize the support that you need, that's going to fit your organization and fit the needs of the size, the staff, the mindset, and the individuals that you have within your staff. So one of the best things I think is to just have a consultation, find some people who can come on the inside. Listen, I've been both an internal and external consultant. And what I know from being an internal consultant is that you are never a prophet in your own land. So there's a challenge with buy-in. There's a a challenge with really, taking what the internal consultants can be offering to really create this kind of behavioral and deep level change that we're talking about over the long term could be really challenging. In addition to the fact, an external support that comes in can be completely dedicated to this particular initiative over the course of 18 months, 12 months, 18 months, for as long as the engagement is necessary. Whereas someone internal they can't take that priority to really spend on one particular initiative. And of course, the cost savings, right? The millions that are spent on trying to implement these initiatives that are usually one-off or very short term, that doesn't allow for the forgetting curve or for lasting engagement or behavioral change, becomes problematic. And it actually becomes a cost-saving initiative to really think about bringing somebody in externally to be able to support you with these initiatives.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think too, what you said about the internal folks being stretched so thin, and there's something to be said for someone who, a focused expert, right, who comes in and is working with.
Exactly. Exactly. And the other thing, one of the things that I mentioned too is that when you bring external experts in, you're bringing people with a specific knowledge base around this particular issue, as opposed to usually you have more generalists within an organization that's trying to meet so many different needs within the organization. You're bringing in people who have years and years of experience really supporting these type of initiatives that can really narrow in on something that's going to make the difference within your organization.
Mhm. And they probably see it a lot faster too, because they're not enmeshed in it every day.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. The results become much quicker. They become more embedded into the day-to-day practice of the work. And people are coming in not running roughshod. I just want to be clear. They're not taking over or pushing, the L&D department aside. They're partnering with them to really be able to create initiatives, because eventually the external is going to leave. And so how do you work with them to be able to incorporate and embed a way of being and a shift in the culture that's going to have long, sustainable results?
What kind of time or financial investment does something like this generally entail?
Yeah, well, that really depends on the size of the organization. It depends on where they are, where they're starting from, and how much work needs to be done. It depends on how comprehensive it needs to be. If it's just really working with up-leveling people that were within the organization, have they created some initiatives that just really need to be really augmented and advanced, or are they really kind of starting from scratch and trying to figure all this out? But from our experience, usually a 12 to up to a 24-month engagement, depending on what we're trying to accomplish, is usually the case for this type of work, because we're talking about shifting culture, we're talking about shifting behavior, we're talking about changing kind of the built environment from the inside out, and that takes time. It's not an overnight proposition, and that's usually where people get wrong. They think, oh, where's the quick fix and the magical wand and the magic unicorn and the special potion that we can like get in, get out, and get back to work. But that kind of thinking is not what's going to create sustainable change. And I would say anywhere from, again, depending on size and the complexity of the issue, from $100,000 to $350,000 of an investment over a course of 18 to 24 months, right, is going to be something that you're going to be able to see some sustainable growth, which makes a huge difference, because you're investing that, but you're saving so much in terms of what you could have to be paying internally, and the cost of not implementing things, the cost of losing individuals, the cost of trying to hire and fill seats that you otherwise could have maybe promoted from within and fostered that growth with. So when you're comparing the cost of not doing something to actually this kind of cost and the savings that you get from implementing some of these programs, it's almost like a no-brainer.
Absolutely. No, I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
So organizations, they start to go down this path, and all of this starts with the best of intentions. Where do organizations get derailed? You mentioned some of the things before, kind of sticking more to the grassroots things
Mm-hmm.
might not
Mm-hmm.
work as well, and not having that structure in place. And then, I think there's presuppositions that, oh, it's going to take forever, or we're not going to see these immediate results, and this is what we want. And, we're going to have to pay millions of dollars to do these things. What other what other issues come up, or that derail these initiatives for organizations when they try to do it themselves?
Yeah, for me, one of the biggest issues is a poor communication strategy.
Mhm.
Oftentimes there's not a thoughtful process, a co-creation process, if you will, between the work that needs to be done and an understanding of the culture where it is right now, and creating a communication strategy that allows everyone to feel heard, seen, invested in, and bought into the process. Part of that communication strategy, particularly when we're talking about doing anything around gender or gender equity in very male dominated environments, is to make sure there is not there usually is I'm losing the word, a no cost, a no sum gain, right? That in order for this to advance, someone has to lose. And so we have to shift the narrative to make it clear that this is a benefit for everyone involved, that this isn't just a female initiative, but it's an organizational initiative, that everyone plays a key role in the process, that it's not leveraging one up in lieu of or in sacrifice of another. And so whenever you're creating these type of initiatives, the communication strategy from the beginning throughout the entire process is critical, to make sure that everyone feels really bought into the process. Of course, there's time and things of that nature, but the way to get around time that we've seen, and particularly with the work that we do, is we help to embed it in the day-to-day practice, right? So it doesn't feel like this add-on thing we have to do while we're trying to meet demands and quotas and initiatives and things of that nature. But how do we begin to embed the work in the day-to-day practice? So when you're at a staff meeting, you're doing the work. When you're in conversations with people, you're doing the work. When you're hiring, when you're doing performance evaluations, when you are having conversations, when you're building projects and putting teams together, that it's embedded in the day-to-day process so that it doesn't feel as if it's a time constraint or is pulling you away from something. And this is often the complaint when we do these massive trainings where everyone goes off site for a few weeks or does a retreat and comes back, and right, as I mentioned, the forgetting curve, what the study shows that 90% of what you learn you forget and over the next week or two, and 70% of that you forget over the next 24 hours, right? So it's really important that we think about creating a strategy that gets embedded so that we don't have that time issue. And in terms of cost, right, as we talked about earlier, the savings of having someone who's specialized and focused in to do this work, that is going to deliver you long lasting results on the back end. So yeah, so for me, one of the biggest challenges is the communication strategy.
I think the communication piece is so important. Do you have, we've sort of been talking a lot in the theoretical. Do you have a sort of a concrete example of an organization that got this right, or maybe mostly right?
Yeah, we actually did some work in a tech company, and they were suffering from the lack of career mobility and attrition with their female leaders. There was just a dearth of not only women and women of color being able to promote to senior levels of leadership. Had a beautiful diversity agenda, had every intention of supporting, but this something just wasn't quite working. So we came in, and part of the issue was their sponsorship was a little wonky. It wasn't formalized. There was no training or support for the people who actually raised their hand to say that they were sponsors. So we came in and we created, as I mentioned before, we created a peer-to-peer collaborative group. We created small groups for the females and females of color to come together to be able to support each other, to get coaching around leadership, around finding their voice, authenticity, all of the issues that would really support them and elevate them into next levels of leadership. And we also worked with all of the individuals who raised their hand to say they would want to be sponsors, to be able to support them, to be able to make sure that they could successfully support these women within this program. And as a result, the work that we did together over the course of 18 months had up-leveled, career mobility and reduced attrition by up to 67%. And we saw women just positioned and supported to be able to move to the next level. So not only did it create a sense of a feeling of commitment to the individuals, to the women that were in the organization who may have thought about leaving and decided not to leave, but it also created a track of mobility for women to be able to step into higher levels of leadership because they were truly being sponsored and truly being supported. We taught them how to create their own to find their own power and voice and really create their own management agenda and to have the support from internal leadership to support that agenda. And then the organization itself became really open to providing space for that. And so the combination of those three factors coming together really made an impact into that organization.
It sounds like it. What an inspiring story. And I mean, the
Yeah.
evidence is clear. So that's phenomenal. What great.
Yeah.
What happens when organizations procrastinate on this?
Well, we kind of see what's going on, right? We know 30% of women are leaving, are anticipated leaving. If you're having a challenge with promoting and advancing, if you're constantly filling roles and positions, then the cost of doing nothing is that, it's going to bleed out and you're going to have a huge problem. We already see, and the data suggests that companies who have female leadership outperform other companies by 30%, right? So that's a big number. So we're talking about loss of millions of dollars in potential bottom line and income if you're not doing anything about this issue within the organization. I always tell people that, what people don't understand is that when you do nothing over time, things don't stay the same. They actually get worse, right? It's kind of like if you have a toothache and you do nothing about it, it's not going to stay the same over time. It's going to get worse, right? Because problems compound upon each other. And so if you're having issues and challenges now and you decide to do nothing, just compound that year after year after year in terms of where you're going to be when you could start now and shift that trajectory upward. And because as problems compound upon each other, solutions compound upon each other. And when you're actually implementing and taking steps to make a difference, you actually start seeing that compound and grow and become even better over time, as opposed to thinking things getting much worse. So the cost of doing nothing, and we've seen this, is millions in lost. I mean, just the number itself, that 30% companies with female leaders outperform by 30%. Just think about a 30% reduction in your revenue over the course of the next year, compounded year after year. I think that kind of speaks for itself.
It certainly does. And I mean, the return on investment is just like you said, it's so much more if organizations take action on this now as opposed to waiting.
Absolutely. When you have more diverse female talent within the organization, your recruitment efforts become so much more easier. You get rid of the bottleneck of the pipeline and create a flow of leaders moving in from creating a pipeline and a pathway for them, not only when they start, but to coming into upper echelons of leadership. Studies show that engagement increases tremendously by 20 or 30%. But they show that in terms of productivity, that there's a huge increase. There's data point after data point showing that when you have a good representation of inclusive leadership within the organization, particularly when you have leaders who are, including leaders of who are female and diverse talent, that the numbers go through the roof.
That's really awesome. Well, you've certainly given our audience a lot to think about today, and certainly I think created a compelling case for paying attention to this issue for sure. Where can folks go to learn more about this topic or to learn more about you?
Well, my website is always a great place to start. So Carol Parker, www.carolparkerwalsh.com. And I'm always on LinkedIn, where I'm always sharing data and information. So please look me up there on LinkedIn. And we also host periodically, we host quarterly executive forums where we invite leaders to come and just be in conversation around these topics. And if that's of interest to you, then reach out and we'll make sure that you get an invitation to our next forum.
If you liked what you heard on today's podcast, please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, and please share this content with your peers. on your social media channels, and in other ways that it'll reach as many people as possible. Our goal is to help more founders achieve success more quickly, and the best way to do that is by sharing our collective knowledge. A rising tide lifts all boats, and the more the WTIA tech community can help and support one another, the better.